Good evening, everyone. My name is Kyle. I'm with High Point Scientific, and tonight I'm joined with Teagan and Matt for our very first Ask an Expert live stream. Tonight we'll be taking your questions on beginner and intermediate astrophotography. We've also collected quite a few questions from social media that we'll be answering. Now, before I go any further, I'd like to first thank everybody for tuning in. It's so fantastic to see you guys here for our live streams, and I enjoy talking to each and every one of you. If you haven't already, we'd love it if you shared this video with your friends and people who might be interested in astrophotography or subscribe to our YouTube channel. We absolutely love getting people inspired about the nighttime sky. It's what we're here to do. Now, I'd also like to introduce our team again. If you've tuned in the past, you're obviously familiar with me and my voice. But Teagan and Matt, if you would, could you introduce yourselves and tell us a little bit about your journey as an astrophotographer? Matt, go ahead and go first.
I'm a product advisor here at High Point Scientific. And I kind of started out years back getting into astronomy, building my own telescopes, making optics, and I kind of came into it from that side of things. And then, of course, I started with visual and connected my Canon camera to the side of my telescope and kind of worked through things. And like most people do, used what we had available and built from there up. And over the years, I've advanced to using, cooled astronomy cameras, color, then monochrome, narrowband filters, LRGB, straight through, adding in off-axis guiders, pretty much the common path that a lot of people take. Interesting that I kind of reverted back to one of my early telescopes that I built and started this with lately. So it's kind of come full circle there, but with some experience and with some more modern, more advanced equipment. So that's kind of my story in a short package.
Awesome.
Nice.
Well, Teagan, go ahead and introduce
I,
yourself as well.
yeah, I'm Teagan, lead content creator for High Point Scientific. I started my astrophotography journey, I would say 6 years ago. I had a Nexstar 8 SE, for visual. I didn't even necessarily know that astrophotography was possible. And then, I had a Canon camera, and I would hold it over my eyepiece to take photos of the moon. And so I'm like, okay, like this is cool. Are there adapters? So I found out, the T ring and T adapter and whatnot. So I took a picture, like a 4-second photo of the Orion Nebula, and I was absolutely blown away that I could even see color. I had star trails and whatnot, but I saw color and I was like, okay, this is absolutely incredible. And it kind of just started from there. And now I use, a full equatorial mount, a 10-inch Newtonian monochrome CMOS camera, and it's been a awesome journey. It's been awesome.
Awesome. That is definitely great to hear your guys' journey in astrophotography. Now we've got a couple questions we'd like to address tonight. That's what we're here all about, is to answer your questions about beginner and intermediate astrophotography. So let's dive right ahead in. We got a bunch of questions in from social media over the last couple of days, so we'll go ahead and answer some of those first. And the first question we have is from our Instagram page, coming from @theamateurastronomer, and they're asking, how important is pixel size for my imaging startup setup? Does binning help? So you guys want to go ahead and tackle that?
Yeah, so I guess I could start off with that. Pixel size is important. It's really important, but from the same point of view, I wouldn't let it limit you from imaging, right? If all you have is a camera and the pixel size isn't a perfect match and it's what you have, use it. You're still going to be able to take awesome pictures. You're going to learn. You're going to be able to, capture things from the sky. You might have star trailing because the pixels are too small and your guiding isn't quite accurate enough, or you know, there's a lot of things that go into this, and it's always best to do the best that you can, match your pixel scale to your focal length, to what you're trying to do with the scope. Are you trying to image small planetary nebula? Are you doing big wide field stuff where you're trying to collect the faintest targets? It can go super technical, but it doesn't have to be. For what we're doing, for most of us, have fun with it. If your pixel size is small and you can bin, do that. Do the best you can with what you have, and then when you can get some more experience or afford some better gear, absolutely do that. But I wouldn't let it stop you from imaging if it's not ideal.
Yeah, you have to consider that where amateur astrophotographers using average equipment under average conditions. Typically, smaller pixels match best with small focal length or short focal lengths. Larger pixels match with long focal lengths. So if you're using like an 8-inch Edge HD, larger pixels around the 4 to 5 micron range are nice. But if you have something, like the 294 or the 183, and your pixel sizes are, 2.6 microns, you will be oversampled. But in post-processing, then you can bend 2x2, in which you're almost perfectly sampled. And it all depends on like your sync conditions. The better your sync conditions are, the more oversampled your pixel scale and resolution can be.
Great answers, guys. Great answers. We have another question in from social media, and they're asking, is it possible to do any astrophotography with a manual equatorial mount? So, Teagan, Matt, you guys want to tackle that one as well?
I'll go ahead and start that. I know back before auto guiding, they had, manual tracking. Matt, I don't know if you've done that, but I have not done any manual tracking. So it makes it difficult to do astrophotography with a manual equatorial mount, but you can do astrophotography with a stationary photographic tripod. You just have to use like the rule of 500s and take exposures short enough so you don't get star trailing. Take a lot of them and stack them. Take your dark frames and whatnot. It is possible. Tough though. I think it's pretty tough.
I did some planetary imaging years back when I started. I just had a manual telescope mount. It didn't have a motor drive or anything, but it had slow motion controls. And what I would get the planet centered, then I would reduce the field of view on my Canon camera, shoot some high-speed video, and just watch that screen and really slowly and carefully try to keep the planet centered. I experimented by moving the planet quickly and then not touching the mount so that, it would have time to settle out, and then using, only 20% of the frames instead of like 50 or 60 or whatever. And actually some of the best planetary images that I've taken so far still were with that silly setup, but I was outside every night, that it was clear, for hours doing planetary imaging, which normally, you do planetary imaging, you're out there for half an hour, something like that. And I'd be out there for hours and hours to get, night after night after night, week after week to get just a couple pictures. So you can do some imaging with it, but it's definitely frustrating. And if you have the patience, you could do some imaging with it, kind of like what Teagan was saying.
I think it's always amazing that, astrophotographers are so dedicated to what we do. We don't mind going out, whether it's hot and like 90 degrees and humid with mosquitoes, or 5 degrees. You're just so dedicated on getting that photo that you'll combat any obstacle that like comes towards you just to get that photo.
Yeah, I can tell you
It's
from
pretty cool.
personal experience, I didn't even start off with an equatorial mount. I literally started off with a broken tripod. A tripod, like one of the legs didn't even extend all the way. And I had a 8-year-old DSLR camera with a 300 millimeter lens and literally no idea what I was doing. I just took a 10-second exposure. I pointed at the Orion Nebula, and I remember zooming in on the live view that night, and I was like, wow, this is unbelievable. Like, I'm able to capture this detail, and I can see nebula like this just from my own backyard. And at the time, I was 19 or so, and I was hooked. I had that fever ever since then. I've been, it's definitely possible though to do things with just like a manual equatorial mount. So that is definitely a great question, and thank you for asking it. We have another question up, and from social media again, and they're asking, is there a recommended ratio of dark frames to light frames? Should it be 1-to-1?
I can go ahead. No, not necessarily. It doesn't have to be 1-to-1. If you're taking a DS with, using a DSLR for astrophotography, I've seen people use dark frames and not dark frames. Some people, it helps, reduce noise. I've seen some people report that using a DSLR and dark frames doesn't really help. Sometimes it hurts their frames or their final image. But in regards to like a dedicated astrophotography or dedicated cooled camera, I typically take around 20 to 30 dark frames. Um, so, if you're taking 15 light frames, adding 15 dark frames, that 1-to-1 ratio is fine. But if you're taking several 1 or 2 minute exposures and your total exposure count is like 300 or 400, you absolutely do not need to take 300 or 400 dark frames. Sticking with that anywhere from 25 to 50, I would say, is a good point to stop. You'll see diminishing returns after that.
Yeah, that's usually about what I shoot too. Especially if it's longer exposures, I'll probably be down around 20, 25. If I'm doing 30-second exposures, I'll let it run for 100 because it takes an hour. I set it up and walk
Exactly.
away.
Yeah, exactly.
But for most stuff, 2-3 minutes, like you said, 40, 50 frames. It's about what I do as well.
Very good. So we have another question, and this is from Astro Denny. By the way, that previous question came from at the real John D. Thank you so much for asking that question. But we have another question from Astro Denny, and they're asking, my biggest problem is with flats over or under correcting. How can I take better flats?
So Teagan will probably be the best for this, but it depends on the camera. It depends on the telescope. Generally, though, 20 to 30,000 ADU, and if that's kind of above where you're at, if you are using sharp cap, if you look at the histogram, it'll give you a total ADU count on the bottom there, and you can just use that as a gauge. And generally, that seems for me to fall about between a third and a halfway down the histogram. You'll see the peak from the left side, and that works well for me. I know Teagan's worked with this a lot more with the camera he has and the filters and everything else. So
No, so yeah, I mean, with every other camera, DSLRs, the ASI 1600, the 183, exposing 28 to 30,000 ADU or 25 to 30 is kind of what I stick with. If I see them undercorrecting or overcorrecting, I'll experiment. I'll take like a set of different flats hitting target ADUs. Sometimes I'll sit at like even down to 12 or 13,000, all the way up to like 45 or 50,000, and then I'll just apply them, restack my data, and just see which looks better. That typically is general for SHO and LRGB filters. So it takes some experimenting, but generally 1/3 of your histogram for a DSLR, 1/3 to half with a DSLR, and 25 to 30K ADU for cool dedicated astronomy cameras.
I do the same thing, taking multiple exposures. I always just use the first one and they calibrate fine, but I take other because it's all set up. I figure let me take a couple extra ones in case I run into an issue. But
Yeah, absolutely.
I'll also add my 2 cents in as well. If you guys have tuned into our live streams in the past, you might be familiar that I use a program called Nina, or Nighttime Imaging and Astronomy. And Nina is an absolutely free, fantastic resource for you to use. It's completely open source. And within Nina, there is a tool called the Flat Wizard. And the Flat Wizard basically will tell your mount to slew to zenith. It'll stop tracking. And then you can put your t-shirt over your optical train, and you can put like a light source if you want to as well, or you can just point it at the sky. And Nina will actually calculate that for you automatically. It'll calculate the right histogram, it'll get your ADU count right, and it'll do all of that for you hands-free. It'll take the guesswork out completely. It's absolutely fantastic, and I could not recommend it enough. So definitely check out Nina if you have the chance. So we got another question in. Well, this is probably our last question from our Instagram page before we start moving on to YouTube and Facebook questions, which we have quite a few. Thank you guys so much for asking your questions. Keep on asking them in the comments. The next question we see, let me see here. How can you best find out your back focus? And that's coming from at Nicole Suthar from our Instagram page.
So it depends on. If I understand the question, it depends. If you're trying to determine what it should be, generally, whatever corrector you're using, the manufacturer will give you specification, right? So whatever field flattener or focal reducer or combination that you're using, coma corrector, whatever that's going to be, they're going to give you a specification. The industry standard is kind of 55 millimeters, and that goes back to the SLR film days. That was the distance from the sensor to the flange for the most part when you use the T-ring, and that continued over into DSLR digital cameras, and because of everything was already in motion, that kind of followed over into cooled astronomy cameras that come with two spacers to set up for your 55 milliback focus. Um, so that's a really common one. A lot of you'll see for like the William Optics scopes and even the Apertura EDR scopes. They have an adjustable flattener on it, so you can fine tune. So it'll say it's set up for a camera that has 55 millimeters of back focus, but the actual distance might be a few millimeters more. And because that flattener is adjustable, it's super easy to tune it in. And if you have a slightly different spacer setup, you usually can compensate for that, within a few millimeters either way. Um, if you're trying to figure out the the physical distance of the spacers that you have set up, digital caliper is a really good way to kind of get a baseline on that. If you have a large sensor camera, you're always going to want to take images and check the corners if you're being really particular about it. If you're just looking to make a cool image, it's going to be a lot less critical than if you're looking for those magazine cover photo type astrophotos. If you have a smaller sensor, it's going to be a lot less critical than if you have a large sensor, and that's kind of a whole nother conversation. But that's kind of the basics of it.
Yeah, I have no additional input. You kind of hit that right on the head. It really depends on what focal reducer or corrector or flattener that you're using, and it's specified by said manufacturer.
I agree. Thank you for the fantastic explanation, Matt. That was really good. Looking some more questions now. We're going to switch on over to our YouTube side. So we have a question from Josh Schultz, and I apologize if I mispronounce anybody's names. They said, I know this is galaxy season, but are there any good wide field objects this time of year? And I'll actually go ahead and answer that one. So it depends on what your definition of wide field is and how long you're willing to stay up. An image I think is a fantastic wide field composition is a group of galaxies known as Markarian's chain, and that is in the constellation of Virgo. Markarian's chain is fantastic because you can get hundreds of galaxies in the field of view with like a 135 millimeter lens, and I've personally done that before, and it gives you that Hubble deep field experience. When you process that photo and then you see the final result, and it's like, oh my goodness, there's galaxies everywhere. So Markarian's chain is probably my recommendation for something at a convenient hour. If you're willing to stay up a few more hours, I'd also recommend checking out the Rho Ophiuchus. I think it's how it's pronounced. Ophiuchus or Ophiuchus. I always mess that one up.
Ophiuchus.
There you go.
I think it's Ophiuchus.
Rho Ophiuchus? Cool. But that is a fantastic wide field shot you can image as well. It's a molecular cloud complex with a bunch of beautiful hydrogen alphas. So that is definitely one I would recommend checking out. I don't know if you guys have any others you'd like to add this time of year.
The one that I'm currently working on and have been, but have stopped because of training, is there's the Jellyfish Nebula, which is starting to set, but there's the Monkey Head Nebula also, and that's probably at like 80 degrees zenith by the time, or 80 degrees altitude by the time sunset. So I get about 4.5 to 5 hours before it hits my trees at about 35 degrees. So that's a good narrowband target to shoot. But other than that, Orion's setting, the Jellyfish Nebula is close to the Monkey Head Nebula, but it's farther down towards the western horizon when the sun sets, so you get even less time on that one. But besides that, you have the Owl Nebula in Ursa Major, which is a small planetary nebula. Great for longer focal lengths. The Leo Triplet, but as far as nebula go, it's galaxy season.
Yeah, not much wide field to do this time of year, unfortunately. But definitely check out Markarian's chain, like I recommended earlier. Some more questions from our YouTube end. This is coming from Chris Martin, and they're asking, what is the best way to combat light pollution? I live in a Bortle 7 to Bortle 8 zone.
Matt, what Bortle zone do you live in?
I'm lucky now. I'm in about a 4. I was in a 5 before.
Man.
Yeah.
Because I know, Kyle, I think you're in a 7 or an 8, and I'm kind of in the same boat. Narrowband filters is the best way to combat light pollution. If you're using a DSLR, or you have the L Extreme, the Optilong, L Enhance. If you're using a monochrome, dedicated SHO filters. that's the best way for sure. But considering it's galaxy season and there are not many nebulae out there to image, and if you're looking to shoot broadband, you can either stick to very short exposures and take a lot of data, um, like a lot of data, like 10 to 15 hours, I would say, depending on, like Bortle 7 or Bortle 8. It's kind of, I stick around anywhere from 15 to 20 hours on an LRGB target and still see the effects of light pollution. But there are light pollution filters out there for broadband, like the L Pro. But I don't have any experience with that
That's
person.
that's probably, I haven't used the L Pro either, but I think that's probably going to be the least aggressive filter that you
Yeah.
could possibly use on some galaxy targets. Like M82 has a lot of hydrogen emissions, so that's kind of a unique target that you could spend some time. I spent quite a bit of time on that with a hydrogen alpha filter, 12 nanometer. It
Yeah.
had some pretty interesting signal on it, but that's all you get. You're missing a huge portion of the galaxy steel. That whole disk that you don't really get as much signal on that, so it's kind of limiting.
Yeah, and like LRGB light pollution filters, from what I've read, like I prefer just not to use them because I've seen it blocks some of the actual broadband data coming from the galaxy or the broadband target itself. But they're a great tool if you live in light polluted areas and you like using light pollution filters. Then yeah, then that's definitely the way to combat your light pollution.
Do you
Travel to
guys want
darker
to?
skies too.
Do you guys like to know the best filter out there? It's no filter. If you can possibly
Yeah.
avoid to, go out to a dark sky site because at the end of the day, getting away from that light pollution is the best you can do. That being said, when I do image in a light polluted zone, I like to use the Optolong L Enhance filter. I find that one really good because I use a color camera. So going back to YouTube and looking at some more questions, we have another question from Astro Aprilla, and again, I apologize if I mispronounce anybody's YouTube names. They say, I don't have an imaging scope per se. I'm using the Celestron 4SE with my Nikon D5500 attached. How important are filters, and what's my best solution for getting decent images?
Um, yeah, there's a lot you could do with a setup like that.
Mhm.
Depending on what mount you have it on, if it's on the 4SE mount, you're going to want to keep your exposures a little bit on the shorter side, being that it's a longer focal length, small aperture scope. That's kind of the opposite thing that you generally want to do with a scope like that. So it does make it a little challenging. But with brighter targets, there's a lot you could do. Orion is kind of setting now, but that's a fun one that you can do with a long focal length scope. Maybe a less than ideal setup, maybe not an equatorial mount, because you can keep the exposures really, really short on that and stack a lot of images over a short period and get a lot of detail. Kind of overcome some of the atmospheric scene conditions sometimes, somewhat like you can do with planetary imaging to some degree.
Yeah.
With darker targets, it's going to be a little tougher with some of the fainter stuff.
You can always increase your ISO. As I don't know if you mentioned, increase your ISO. Typically like 800 to 1600 is standard, but if you're shooting a 1500 millimeter focal length and you're using an alt azimuth mount, I wouldn't suspect that you can get more than 5-second exposures. Um, maybe 7. From like I said, when I started, I used the Nexstar 8SE, and that's at 2000 millimeters, I was getting about 3 to 5-second exposures. So increasing ISO is another way to combat that, the lack of exposure time that you're getting. But absolutely possible with the Nexstar 4SE, to get your feet wet, to start understanding camera settings and focal length and how to attach your camera to your scope, and that kind of understanding how everything kind of works together.
Yeah.
You can absolutely get photos, especially brighter targets.
Oh, you can have a lot of fun.
Yeah.
For sure. We have another question from Hogarth's Astrophotography, and they're asking a question about flat frames and ADU. I will say, Hogarth, that question's a little bit beyond the scope of this live stream, so we'd strongly recommend if you get the chance to actually DM that question regarding flat frame ADUs to our Instagram page. That way we can take a little bit more time to research that question and get a more accurate answer for you. So looking through some of our other questions, Alexandra Rose is asking, they're a newbie, and they have a Red Cat and ZWO 533. I live in New York. What's my best target? I'll tell you from experience, I think with a similar setup as that, I would recommend the Orion Nebula, the Andromeda Galaxy. Living in New York, I assume you're going to have a lot of light pollution. So if you can manage to get your hands on it, get a light pollution filter. Otherwise, try to get some dark skies. I don't know if you guys have anything more to add to that, but that's kind of what I would recommend.
And if you're looking for targets now, the Orion, like I said, it's pretty low. But Galaxy C, then everything's like magnitude 7 or dimmer. I feel, and it's hard to pick a target, especially a wide field target. That's kind of a tough situation. But if you have a light pollution filter, the Monkey Head Nebula, like I said, is right overhead. It should combat the light pollution filter through that. It's a dual band filter, so you have the hydrogen alpha and oxygen 3 lines coming through with the Optilong L extreme or the L enhanced, for instance. So that would be my recommendation until Milky Way season comes around.
Great explanation. So switching on over to Facebook now, we're going to answer some questions there. We got a question from Mike, and they're asking, how do you guys choose exposure times for deep sky objects?
I guess it kind of depends on what I'm doing. So with modern sensors, you can do a lot with a little, as long as you're not shooting narrowband. That's a different thing, for the most part, from my experience anyway. If you're shooting LRGB or one-shot color cameras, you can take a lot shorter exposure times than you might think you would. I've been using a CGE M mount, and it's a little lacking compared to some of the other stuff that I've used, especially with the size telescope that I'm using on it. So I have to keep my exposure times pretty short, to get nice round stars and good looking images. And I'm shooting the Hamburger Galaxy right now. I just had about 7 hours a couple nights ago on it, and I'm using a 178 cooled camera. It's discontinued now, but 30-second exposures. I shot 7 hours of 30-second exposures, and you can see an incredible amount of detail in the cloud band, right through the center of it. If I'm shooting narrowband through that same setup, I'm looking to get minutes, and it's difficult. It's difficult. Typically, that time of year, I'll use a different telescope, shorter focal length, something a lot lighter, something less susceptible to wind, and that's really when I'll push it. If I'm going to, I mentioned Orion before, shooting that at short exposure times. 4-second exposures I did. I also did a run at 1 second and half-second exposures just to see. 4 seconds kind of seemed to be the happy place. I did 7,000 exposures and treated that like a planetary image, and took the best 75% of that. And you would think that it was shot with such a larger telescope, but it's just because it's essentially a cooled planetary camera and a long focal length scope. So that it depends on what you're doing, really. But in general, if I would just say on average, if you could do a 60-second to 2-minute exposure for most targets, that's probably going to get you some pretty decent results. I'm sure there's a mathematical formula out there to determine exactly the exposure that would be best for your situation, but I'm doing this for fun for the most part, so I just kind of guess and check and use past experience.
Yeah, no, I would agree. For Kyle, were they referring to individual sublength or like total exposure time, or was it just kind of unclear?
I don't think they specified. I think they're just asking. I assumed from the question they're asking just, for a single frame.
Okay. Well, yeah. I guess to piggyback off Matt, there's not much else that I would recommend. If you're in darker skies, you can expose for longer. Pay attention to your stars. If they're too bloated, then maybe reduce that exposure time. If you're in light polluted skies, then 30 seconds, 120 seconds, depending. It's what you should stick with. I guess if you're talking total exposure time, which I think is also important to address, do it until you are satisfied with your final image. I know, Matt, you typically shoot anywhere from 7 to 15 hours.
Yeah,
I would say from.
Yeah, I always wish that I could get about twice that. but
Right.
that's about
Um,
what I shoot. Yeah.
and yeah, if you have clear skies all the time, I like to shoot anywhere from, I mean, 7 to 15 hours is great if the target is bright. The brighter the target, the less exposure time you need. But like 20, 25, 30 hours, just it makes the data cleaner, and after that, it makes post processing so much simpler because you don't have to worry about processing out all the artifacts that would come with a lack of exposure time. So it saves you time in the end. You get a higher quality image. As far as total exposure time, more is never a bad thing.
Yeah. Especially in those faint areas. That's what I love about
Absolutely.
your images because you put the time in on it. All those faint areas, there's low noise, they look good. It makes a huge difference. If you're
Yeah,
just looking to do EAA, kind of have fun, see different things, that's one thing. But as far as like making the best image that you can, Teagan's always telling me 20, 30 hours, 20 hours on this one, Matt, 20 hours on this one, Matt. And it makes a huge difference.
yeah. Like if your main goal is quality, increase your exposure time. So
And we have a video just on that topic on why exposure time matters. So that's definitely something I would recommend checking out on our YouTube channel if you haven't already. So we've been live streaming now for about 30 minutes or so. Thank you guys for asking the fantastic questions. We're getting a lot of questions in tonight. All of them are really fantastic. We do apologize in advance if we don't happen to get to your question. It's not that we don't want to. It's just we have to, keep moving on, make sure we get as many questions as we can thoroughly answered. But if we do happen to miss your question, please feel free to go on Instagram and direct message us, and we'll be more than happy to answer your questions after the stream. But that being said, we'll try not to miss your question. But yeah, if you're just tuning in, again, if you have the chance, please feel free to like this video, not comment, excuse me, what I'm talking about. Like this video on our Facebook page, and on YouTube, go ahead, if you haven't already, subscribe to our channel. It really means a lot to us. It helps get the word out there and get people inspired about astronomy in the nighttime sky. So looking for some more questions that have been coming in. This is a question from Nancy, and they're asking, what if you have a APO triplet refractor, 102 millimeter, and an 8-inch Schmidt Cassegrain? Which would you use for galaxies?
What camera do you have? I guess plays a lot into that. If you have a 183, the 102 might be better. If you have something with big pixels, a good tracking mount, there's a lot of variables there.
yeah, me personally, if you want the resolution, if I had the 183, yeah, it's a small sensor, but because you have small pixels, you can bend and still maintain that somewhat decent resolution. I think bend you get like a 4.6 megapixel photo, which isn't too bad, especially at 2,000 millimeters. If you're imaging the Whirlpool Galaxy, you're going to be right up on that sucker. It's going to like fill your field of view. But you get like 4 times the light gathering power with the 8-inch or the Schmidt Cassegrain. But of course, if it's a larger galaxy and you want to stay more on the conservative side of resolution and whatnot, then the 102 would definitely be the way to go in that situation. So yeah, it depends on your target and like Matt said, what camera that you have.
Great explanation.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, looking for some more questions here. We got a question from Cameron Gills, and they're asking, should I use an IR cut filter for broadband targets like galaxies? What are the benefits of this filter? Noise reduction?
I don't. Some people do. Some people recommend it. A lot of the smaller sensor cameras might come with an IR cut filter.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the really large sensor cameras don't come with an IR cut filter. I've used both, and I've had good results. If I didn't have one, I wouldn't, feel like I was, like I was missing something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I know in most planetary cameras, using an IR cut does cut down some of this turbulence in the atmosphere, I believe. But as far as like deep sky astrophotography, the luminance filter, if you have a monochrome camera, the luminance filter is automatically, a cut filter. I haven't compared like a luminance filter versus no filter at all on a monochrome camera. I don't know if you'd see the difference. But to reduce star bloat, I think it's
Yeah.
not bad
Depending
to
on the
have.
depending on the optics.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Great
In an all
explanation.
reflecting system, it it's not going to be necessary at all because there is no chromatic aberration. Again, this is getting a little more technical. In a doublet, something that might have a little bit more. If you look at Astronomic, they sell 3 luminance filters in L1, 2, and 3, and those are all, like Teagan said, UV IR cut filters. That's by design what they are. And one model is narrower, one model is wider, and one kind of sits in the middle. So if you had, maybe a more entry-level telescope that was a doublet, you'd want one a little narrower. In an ideal situation, a little bit better optics, you could use a wider one. You're going to be able to take great pictures with any of them. But if you're looking to to do the best that you can and match the best that you can, there are options there.
Yeah.
Great explanations. Looking for some more questions. I got a question from Daniel, and they're saying, I'm in a Bortle 4 zone and use a one-shot color camera. Filter or not to filter? That is the question.
I don't. But if you're looking at narrowband targets, it's definitely going to help to increase that background contrast. And there's a lot you can do. You can split color channels and kind of treat it like a narrowband image to some extent. Or if you're doing a star party and you just wanted to have more contrast in a shorter time, that could be good. I don't, but there's nothing wrong with using one.
Yeah, and Bortle 4, no, I wouldn't use a light pollution filter if I had a one-shot color, because I want to get the most natural color possible and take advantage of the Bortle 4 skies. I guess some people have issues with their light pollution filters giving you like a gradient. I guess that's mostly narrowband filters, but if you're going to, LRGB filters, like the L Pro or something, I would say just stick with the dark skies that you have and take advantage of it.
Yeah, I've got great results over the years in this little bit darker skies from where I was.
Yeah.
With no filter at all. As long as you put in the time on the exposures, like you said before, put in the time, and you can get great results.
And sort of my answer to that is, why not both? I actually like to image depending on my target. Obviously, I don't do this if it's a galaxy, but a trick I have figured out is you can actually, with a one-shot color camera, you can take like an L-enhanced filter, right? And if you look at the channels in the L-enhanced filter, you have 3 different channels, and they're readily mapped to where it is strongest in hydrogen alpha, right? But if you have a RGB image of the same nebula, you can actually combine the red channel in the LRGB image with the red channel from the L-enhanced filter, or any dual bandpass narrowband filter like that that's designed for color cameras, and combine the two to actually enhance the reds. So you could do both, and we actually have a tutorial on YouTube on how exactly to do that. That was a neat little trick, and it really, really changed a lot for my astrophotography. So great answers, guys. Looking for
Kyle, the method that that you use for your L-enhanced combination with LRGB is what actually I've adopted for adding H alpha to LRGB data, and it's nice.
You can kind of flip that too. So sometimes I've been playing where I'll shoot narrowband with the mono camera, and then I shoot color through the RGB camera, and then I'll resample the color data to fit the size of the hydrogen alpha, and I use the hydrogen alpha as a luminance layer and just apply the color to the other one. So you have this super high contrast image because it's a hydrogen alpha as a luminance, but you're applying the color data to it. Is it scientifically useful? Absolutely not, but it's super fun. It looks great, and it's pretty easy to do, especially if you're lucky enough to have 2 cameras. So yeah, there's no limit to what you can do. There's no rules as far as how you're supposed, how you can and cannot combine this stuff.
Great explanations. We have another question from Josh. Josh Kovac, and again, I apologize if I mispronounce your name. They're asking any advice for carrying a heavy tripod rig in terrain that's no good for wheelie bars. So this is kind of a specific question to what this person is dealing with. But do you have any advice in general on how to carry a sort of a heavy rig around?
It's just that's
There's cases that you can buy, just zip cases with like a handle strap that you can strap over your shoulder. Hopefully, you're close enough to your car from your imaging location where you can kind of go back and take strips, and you don't have to haul your OTA and then your bag and all your accessories together. But if you're going to a dark sky site, you do want to absolutely consider portability of your imaging setup. Like a sky tracker, a Red Cat, or a 135 millimeter lens, or a DSLR and a dedicated Astrocam. Something light, something that you can carry maybe in a backpack, is important to consider.
I went to a dark sky site last year, and I brought a CGXL mount and a 9.25-inch Celestron, and then I brought the equivalent of an EQM 35 mount. So I packed all this stuff, drove 4 or 5 hours, and the CGXL never left the car.
You use the EQM mount.
So yeah, because it's the head weighs 55 pounds on it, alone. So even though I had it there, just the effort involved was not at the time worth getting a little bit better tracking.
I swear that people who have like a CGXL who take it outside regularly, for example, they've got to be power lifters because that thing's incredibly heavy, and I can't imagine lugging that. I had the CGX for a little bit, and that thing was a chore to carry in and out. It was a absolute headache, and
monsters.
Yeah, having an observatory in this situation is so helpful. So looking around for some more questions, we have a question I believe I just wanted to answer. It was from Steve Hand, and they're asking, how do you know what way to put filters in?
So with mounted filters, it's pretty easy. Usually the thread goes towards the camera. On unmounted filters, depending on the filter, it may or may not matter. If it's a mounted filter, a lot of times you can go off the lettering. Some brands have a direction on them printed on the ring. Teagan, do you have any input on that?
I know that if you take your unmounted filter, now I have 50-50 shot at this, so I might be getting confused. You take your filter and you put a pen or pencil, and you look at the reflection of the filter, and if you see like the pen reflecting in 3 different, it almost looks like it's refracting 3 times within your filter. So you see like 3 pencils over your filter through the reflection. I think that needs to be pointing away from you, or towards the camera, away from the oncoming light. And if you flip your filter over, it should just reveal just a single reflection, and that should go towards the oncoming light. Now, again, that may be flipped.
No, you're square on that.
Okay, but that's the way that I've had my filters mounted in my filter wheel for like 5 years. So I don't know.
No, that would cut down on internal reflections, generally speaking, because your most reflective surface would be on the front, so you wouldn't have that reflection bouncing back between the substrate.
Okay.
Great explanation.
Again, it depends on the filter.
Substrate.
So we have another question from Facebook, and this is coming from Rico. They're saying they're very much a beginner here. I have the AVX equatorial mount. Can you get away without using an auto guide star tracker like PHD2, for example, or are those a must-have?
Kyle, I think you have the AVX. I've never actually used one. I don't know if Matt has.
Yeah, I could go ahead and answer that one. With the AVX, it depends. I use PHD2 for almost everything because I'm very obsessive. I really like to have super tiny stars for like 10-minute exposures, even if I'm shooting with a 135 millimeter lens. With the AVX, it's not necessarily strictly needed. It just depends on what your setup is. If you're going to image like a camera lens, for example, then you really don't need an auto guider if you just want to do like 60-second exposures. But if you want to do like 5, 10, 15 minutes, you'll definitely want to consider some sort of guiding software like PHD2, even with a low focal length lens. And the reason for that is sometimes the AVX might suffer from things like backlash. All mounts sort of suffer from that too, but it's something PHD2 can take care of through calibration. It can actually measure the backlash in your mount. So I would recommend getting it, but it's not strictly possible. You can also do things in PHD2 such as dither. If you have a really bad like tracking, sometimes dithering might not even be needed because the stars will just sort of naturally shift for you. But if you have like really good at tracking and you want to take multiple long exposures, it's really important to dither your images through PHD2. And what dithering essentially is doing micro shifts of like 4 to 5 pixels to up, down, left, right as you're doing exposures, and that will reduce, I believe, the read noise of the sensor, if not mistaken, because sometimes that noise pattern will stack on itself, and so you'll, despite taking long exposures, you will get noise in it. Even if you stack like 15, 20, 30, 40 exposures, you're also stacking the read noise in the camera. So I would recommend getting PHD2 even if you have a really easy to use setup. Great questions.
Yeah, all good points, I think. Yeah.
So we have a question from Facebook again. They're Bill Stewart. Bill's asking, how do I locate objects without the ability to plate solve on a non-go-to mount?
So I used to do this. It's kind of how I started out, was with just a simple manual mount, and I added motors to it, and then I kind of hacked the controller and put in an auto guiding port. But essentially, it's going to be the same way you would for visual use. Is you're going to want to use star charts, the monthly printouts you can get from places. If you have a Telrad, there's Telrad finder charts, which are really awesome and are super helpful in finding these targets. A lot of the brighter ones are a lot easier to find. You can use a wide field eyepiece to try to locate them. When I first started doing imaging with my DSLR, I had a 70 to 200 lens on it. I would set it to 70, take a really long exposure, knowing that the stars are going to be blurred. I didn't care. I'd crank the ISO, and I'm just looking for that faint, fuzzy section in the sky, right? And then I can say, oh, that must be the Andromeda Galaxy. Then I'll center that in my faint, fuzzy, long exposure, and then zoom the camera in and refocus from there. So depends on the target, but there's a lot of different ways that you can find things and kind of work around it. Just becoming more familiar with the sky in general, binoculars, using a planisphere, learning the main star names and the constellations, and kind of building up from there is probably one of the better ways to learn where those objects are, so that you could find them without a go-to mount or without plate solving.
I will agree. I think understanding the night sky, and you gain that information as you become more familiar with astrophotography and you do it more. But gaining understanding of the night sky, where the bright stars are, where the constellations are, is a huge help. Because if you have like a mobile planetarium app, that definitely helps. But like you said, the best way I think on a non-go-to mount is to take a long exposure, knowing that you'll have star trails, and see if you can see your object within your frame, and then center it from there. Camera lenses and short focal length scopes, it's much easier to start off that with something that's short focal length than trying to find an object at 2,000 millimeters. And that's kind of what I started doing. If my go-to wasn't on point with my Nexstar 8SE, I would just move up left, take a photo, up left, take a photo, and just kind of circle around the target. Sometimes I'd spend 20 minutes looking for a target at 2,000 millimeter focal length, and it's a chore. But yeah.
So Teagan, this question goes directly into your answer there, and this is a question from Tariq. They're asking, so my question again is regarding off-axis guider recommendations for a 10-inch RC truss scope. So do you have any recommendations for a good off-axis guider there?
As far as off-axis guiding, stick with your brand of camera. If you have a QHY camera, stick with a QHY off-axis guider. If you have an ZWO dedicated camera, the ZWO off-axis guider. It just the adapters tend to mesh easier, and you don't have to get custom adapters to fit everything. So stick with like brand, and it also depends on your, a larger prism, like for example the ZWO off-axis guider, the large version. It's a larger pickoff prism, so you're going to have more light coming through up to your guide camera, which allows you to see more stars. Um, Even if you have a small off-axis guider, now I don't know what specific camera that you'd be using, so it's hard to recommend a specific off-axis guider for you. But the modern day CMOS cameras are really sensitive, so even if you have a small OAG, finding a guide star, personally speaking, has never been an issue for me. And I used a QHY 5L2 that's almost 7 years old. And there's only been one time that I haven't been able to find a guide star, um, no matter how I rotated it. And I was shooting at 2,000 millimeter focal length. But besides that, do find an off-axis guider that just fits with your camera and matches your back focus.
Great explanation.
And,
Matt, do you have anything you want to add there?
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. There are, there's lots of options, but that's probably the best way to simplify it, and just make sure that you have initial success with your, like Teagan said, they're designed to fit within that 55 millimeter standard back focus. If you're not using a corrector on that RC, you're not using a field flattener, you're using a smaller chip, have at it. There's on an RC, they have, 3-inch, 6 inches back focus you can play with by adding and removing spacers. But if you want to future proof it, if you are using a corrector, ideally you would want to stick to that same brand.
Good explanation. So we have a question here from Christopher Foster. They're asking, newbie here, just bought an EQ6 Pro mount, by the way, great mount. I really love it. I also have one of those. And they're waiting on a 10-inch Newtonian. They bought a ZWO 294 one-shot color camera. Didn't buy a guide scope yet. They have a MacBook Pro. Where should I start software-wise? So that's a good question because that is specifically regarding Macs. And Macs don't necessarily mesh up with Windows, unfortunately, when it comes to software. Things like CPWI, I don't believe are Mac compatible. Do you guys have any recommendations?
MacObservatory.com is a good resource that I recommend. At work normally. I don't have a Mac. I don't use a Mac, but as far as what I've found available for information and what software is available, it's a fantastic resource.
I know one in particular that I have heard of, but again, I've used Windows exclusively. But one thing that I've heard of is Ecos and K-Stars. K-Stars is a planetarium software for Mac OS, and Ecos is sort of the automation software that go with K-Stars. So I've heard of those two being used by some astrophotographers with a MacBook, so I'd recommend checking out there. I think PhD2 actually does work with MacBook, but I could be mistaken. I'll have to double check to make sure. So if you use something like K-Stars or Ecos, I think you'd be able to do pretty good. On Windows, for drivers, for example, you have ASCOM, but for Mac and Linux, I believe as well, you use the Indy server as sort of your one-stop sort of location for drivers. So definitely check that out as well. Teagan, I don't know if you have anything you want to add.
No, I know you can run Windows parallel through OS, Mac. And I've seen lots of people use that. A lot is in like 3 or 4 successfully. I do not have a Mac. I use Windows exclusively. So pretty sure that PhD runs on Mac and Windows, but as far as other like sequencer softwares or full automation softwares, whatever Kyle recommended, that's probably a good idea to consider. As I know the SkyX is a Microsoft software that you can use, but it's pretty heavy as far as the learning curve goes, from what I've heard.
For sure. So we have a question from David Mansell. They're asking, hi guys, I've never been able to get sharp images with my Schmidt Cassegrain as I can with my refractor. Is that just normal?
Um, well, you'll see a lot of times in SCTs, depending on what it is, but just a standard SCT like a Celestron C8 or something like that. The stars are generally a little bit larger size. It has to do some with sampling. Um, Refractors in general are easier optics to manufacture because most of the surfaces are spherical, which are really easy to make on machines. Um, an SCT is the same thing. Your primary and secondary are spherical, but that secondary, the corrector plate is a thin zero power aspheric surface, and it's Celestron came up with the way to make it years ago, and they're really great at it, and they're awesome. But it's yeah, it's I could say in my own experience with refractors, usually shorter focal lengths as well, so they kind of go hand in hand. Your sampling rate changes too. I've seen smaller star sizes. The Apertura 6-inch RC that I was using for a little while, that had pretty tight small stars in it. I was really happy with that. It was much better than the 9 1/4 Celestron I use. Do you have anything to add on that, Teagan?
Um, it. I would say it seems in general, if you have a refractor, you're going to be probably undersampled for the most part, if not like really well sampled. So your stars are going to be like nice pinpoint. With an SCT, you are going to get that little bit of blow because of all the optical imperfections as you talked about, that I'm not exactly an expert on. Um, but like the edge optics, I believe are an improvement over
Sure.
the C8s for sure. But scene conditions are a huge part of it. If your skies are just turbulent, you unfortunately, live under the jet stream, across the U.S., you're gonna see effects of that. Absolutely, and it's having large pixels to overcome that does help a little bit, but scene conditions are another big part of that, which refractors um, aren't always succumb to, just because larger optics do increase the effects of that as well. So it's generally understood that um, photos through a refractor might be a little bit, as far as stars go, tighter and sharper than an SCD.
But you should still be able to get nice, sharp detail in your galaxies, whatever that target is, right? That's not that really saturated point source light. Um, and that same 9 1/4 inch Celestron I was talking about, NGC 7331, I think it is. It's one of those larger mid-size galaxies by Stevens Quintuplet, and that's I had a phenomenal image with that Celestron scope. The galaxy is just so sharp, so much detail in the core of it and everything. But as you move out towards that center, because it is just a standard SCT, there's a lot of coma. Even with smaller chips, it's there. The stars get larger. There's some defocus as you move away, but an SCT without any corrector is great for those smaller mid-sized targets. Um,
Yeah, and I would argue also that with the SCT versus 72 millimeter refractor or 4-inch refractor, the amount of detail that you're going to capture and resolution, even if you're seeing as poor, is going to be significant over the refractor. So if you're going for nice detail, the 8SE or the longer focal length scope, the larger aperture scope is going to win. There are star reduction techniques in post processing, deconvolution for extremely undersampled imaging scales, whatnot, is something to consider as well.
For sure. Great explanation, guys. So I think we have time for one last question before we're going to wrap it up for the night. Again, thank you guys so much for tuning in. The questions you've been answering are absolutely fantastic. Thank you guys so much for taking the time to ask us your questions. We've absolutely loved taking the time to answer them, and it's been great to talk to each and every one of you as always tonight. But looking through some questions, see if we can get one more in. Just trying to look for one that we haven't already answered. We have a question from Derek Wilson, and they're asking, if I have a DSLR with a full spectrum mod, what is the advantage or purpose of using an additional H alpha clip-in filter? So basically, what's the purpose of an H alpha filter if you have a full spectrum modded camera?
So the H alpha modification um, basically removes the filter that was on your sensor to begin with from the factory, and that factory filter blocks a huge portion of the hydrogen light, right? So maybe it might pass 30% of that light or 40% of that light that is available to it. When you modify the camera, you get rid of that um, filter that's on there, and now the camera is more sensitive to the hydrogen light. When you add a clip-in filter for hydrogen alpha, that is blocking all other light from the visible spectrum except for that hydrogen alpha. Depending on the bandpass, it could be 3 nanometers, 6, 12, whatever that is. It's blocking everything outside of that narrow portion of the spectrum. So because the Canon or DSLR has been astro modified, it's sensitive to the hydrogen alpha light. And by using that clip-in filter, you're taking advantage of that increased sensitivity and blocking the rest of the light, creating a really high contrast image that also is going to show you where the hydrogen is in that nebula. So that's kind of how that can benefit you. Even though it is going to be a color camera, you can still collect that information.
For
Teagan,
sure.
do you have any
Nailed
to
it.
add?
Yeah, no. Yeah, exactly.
All right.
Alrighty.
No more to add to that.
Well, I think that's going to do it for us tonight. Thank you guys so much for asking your wonderful questions. Again, it was an absolute joy to answer each and every one of them. Again, my name is Kyle, and I'm joined with Teagan and Matt. It's been an absolute pleasure. Until next time, we're going to wrap up the stream for the night. Thank you so much for tuning in, and always remember to keep